Thank you all very much for being a part of today's program of Eventide Tales. We have a wonderful collection of stories to tell for you today and a sterling collection of actors to tell them for you. Before we begin, I just want to do a couple of program notes. First of all, I want to say that Eventide Tales is supported in part by the Brewster, Chatham, Dennis, Falmouth, Harwich, Orleans, Sandwich, Eastham, Wellfleet, and Mid-Cape Cultural Councils. And it's thanks to their grants that we are able to do this show for you. All of those cultural councils are in turn supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. A couple of upcoming events that we have coming up next on April 3rd at 4 o'clock, a week from now. It's the return of our virtual playhouse, and that's going to be a premiere of a brand new play called Quakeress by a playwright named Matt Senni. And just to also let you know, we will be doing Eventide Tales on April 10th. That is National Poetry Month in April, and we will be doing a program featuring poetry. The other thing I want to let you know is that on May 27th is going to be one of our programs from the 2021 season. It is a virtual production which will be done in conjunction with the Cape Cod Media Center called Twain by the Tale, which is a collection of stories and skits by Mark Twain, which we will be producing for you. And as I say, that is going to be coming up on May 27th. So I hope you all are around and will support those programs. We look forward to presenting them for you. And now we are going to begin our program for the afternoon. Our first story today is by Anton Chekhov. He was a Russian playwright and short story writer who's considered to be among the greatest writers of short fiction in history. His career as a playwright produced 4 classics, and his best short stories are held in high esteem by writers and critics. In the next story, The Bet, a banker and a young lawyer make a bet about whether the death penalty is better or worse than life in prison. The story will be read by Cleo Zani.
The Bet by Anton Chekhov. It was a dark autumn night. The old banker was walking up and down his study and remembering how 15 years before he had given a party one autumn evening. There had been many clever men there, and there had been interesting conversations. Among other things, they had talked of capital punishment. The majority of the guests, among whom were many journalists and intellectual men, disapproved of the death penalty. They considered that form of punishment out of date, immoral, and unsuitable for Christian states. In the opinion of some of them, the death penalty ought to be replaced everywhere by imprisonment for life. I don't agree with you, said their host, the banker. I have not tried either the death penalty or imprisonment for life, but if one may judge a priori, the death penalty is more moral and more humane than imprisonment for life. Capital punishment kills a man at once, but lifelong imprisonment kills him slowly. Which executioner is the more humane? He who kills you in a few minutes, or he who drags a life out of you in the course of many years? Well, both are equally immoral, observed one of the guests, for they both have the same object, to take away life. The state is not God. It has not the right to take away what it cannot restore when it wants to. Among the guests was a young lawyer, a young man of 25. When he was asked his opinion, he said, the death sentence and the life sentence are equally immoral, but if I had to choose between the death penalty and imprisonment for life, I would certainly choose the second. To live anyhow is better than not at all. A lively discussion arose. The banker, who was younger and more nervous in those days, was suddenly carried away by excitement. He struck the table with his fist and shouted at the young man, "It's not true. I'll bet you 2 million. You would stay in solitary confinement." "Agreed. You stake your millions, and I stake my freedom," said the young man.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry we've had a problem with Cleo's feed.
And then this wine.
And,
Hey,
yeah, you're freezing up, Cleo, and, for not a little, not a short time too. So I think we're going to have to forego that one. Hmm?
okay, I will sign off, see what I can do.
Okay. Yeah. You're freezing up again. Heard you're going to sign off and see what we can do, but we're going to move along to the next one. Stephen, are you ready?
Get back to was.
Yes, yes, I am.
Okay. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, known by his pen name Mark Twain, was an American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. His most popular work is familiar to all Americans. William Faulkner even called him the father of American literature, despite the fact that he dropped out of school in fifth grade to earn money to help his family. In the next story, Wit Inspirations of the Two-Year-Olds, the great author gives us an insight into his precocious infancy. The story will be read by Stephen Rourke.
Wit Inspirations of the Two-Year-Olds by Mark Twain. All infants appear to have an impertinent and disagreeable fashion nowadays of saying smart things on most occasions that offer, and especially on occasions when they ought not to be saying anything at all. Judging by the average published specimens of smart sayings, the rising generation of children are little better than idiots. And the parents must surely be little better than the children, for in most cases, they are the publishers of the sunbursts of infantile imbecility which dazzle us from the pages of our periodicals. I may seem to speak with some heat, not to say a suspicion of personal spite, and I do admit that it nettles me to hear about so many gifted infants in these days, and remember that I seldom said anything smart when I was a child. I tried it once or twice, but it was not popular. The family were not expecting brilliant remarks from me, and so they snubbed me sometimes and spanked me the rest. But it makes my flesh creep and my blood run cold to think what might have happened to me if I had dared to utter some of the smart things of this generation's 4-year-olds where my father could hear me. To have simply skinned me alive and considered his duty at an end would have seemed to him criminal leniency toward one so sinning. He was a stern, unsmiling man and hated all forms of precocity. If I had said some of the things I have referred to and said them in his hearing, he would have destroyed me. He would indeed, provided the opportunity remained with him. But it would not, for I would have had judgment enough to take some strychnine first and say my smart thing afterward. The fair record of my life has been tarnished by just one pun. My father overheard that, and he hunted me over 4 or 5 townships seeking to take my life. If I had been full grown, of course, he would have been right, but child as I was, I could not know how wicked a thing I had done. I made one of those remarks, ordinarily called smart things, before that, but it was not a pun. Still, it came near causing a serious rupture between my father and myself. My father and mother, my uncle Ephraim and his wife, and one or two others were present, and the conversation turned on a name for me. I was lying there trying some India rubber rings of various patterns and endeavoring to make a selection, for I was tired of trying to cut my teeth on people's fingers and wanted to get hold of something that would enable me to hurry the thing through and get to something else. Did you ever notice what a nuisance it was cutting your teeth on your nurse's finger, or how backbreaking and tiresome it was trying to cut them on your big toe? And did you never get out of patience and wish your teeth were in Jericho long before you got them half cut? To me, it seems as if these things happened yesterday. And they did to some children. But I digress. I was lying there trying the India rubber rings. I remember looking at the clock and noticing that in an hour and 25 minutes, I would be 2 weeks old, and thinking how little I had done to merit the blessings that were so unsparingly lavished upon me. My father said, "Abraham is a good name. My grandfather was named Abraham." My mother said, "Abraham is a good name. Very well. Let us have Abraham for one of his names." I said, "Abraham suits the subscriber." My father frowned. My mother looked pleased. My aunt said, "What a little darling it is." My father said, "Isaac is a good name and Jacob is a good name." My mother assented and said, "No names are better. Let us add Isaac and Jacob to his names." I said, "All right, Isaac and Jacob are good enough for yours truly. Pass me that rattle, please. I can't chew India rubber rings all day." Not a soul made a memorandum of these sayings of mine for publication. I saw that and did it myself, else they would have been utterly lost. So far from meeting with a generous encouragement like other children when developing intellectually, I was now furiously scowled upon by my father. My mother looked grieved and anxious, and even my aunt had about her an expression of seeming to think that maybe I had gone too far. I took a vicious bite out of an India rubber ring and covertly broke the rattle over the kitten's head, but said nothing. Presently, my father said, "Samuel is an excellent name." I saw the trouble was coming. Nothing could prevent it. I laid down my rattle. Over the side of the cradle, I dropped my uncle's silver watch, the clothes brush, the toy dog, the tin soldier, the nutmeg grater, and other matters which I was accustomed to examine and meditate upon and make pleasant noises with and bang and batter and break when I needed wholesome entertainment. Then I put on my little frock and my little bonnet and took my pygmy shoes in one hand and my licorice in the other and climbed out on the floor. I said to myself, "Now, if the worst comes to worst, I am ready." Then I said aloud in a firm voice, "Father, I cannot wear the name of Samuel." "My son!" "Father, I mean it, I cannot." "Why?" "Father, I have an invincible antipathy to that name." "My son, this is unreasonable. Many great and good men have been named Samuel." "Sir, I have yet to hear of the first instance." "What? There was Samuel the prophet. Was not he great and good?" "Not so very." "My son, with his own voice the Lord called him." "Yes, sir, and had to call him a couple of times before he could come." "And then I sallied forth, and that stern old man sallied forth after me. He overtook me at noon the following day, and when the interview was over, I had acquired the name of Samuel, and a thrashing, and other useful information. And by means of this compromise, my father's wrath was appeased, and a misunderstanding bridged over, which might have become a permanent rupture if I had chosen to be unreasonable. But judging by this episode, what would my father have done to me if I had ever uttered in his hearing one of the flat, sickly things these 2-year-olds say in print nowadays? In my opinion, there would have been a case of infanticide in our family.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to bring back Cleo and see if we've gotten the technical problems done. Cleo, are you there?
I am. We can give it another try.
All right, let's go ahead. This is The Bet by Anton Chekhov.
As I have been saying, the assembled guests of this banker had been discussing the merits, as such, of the death penalty versus imprisonment for life. Among the guests was a young lawyer, a young man of 25. When he was asked his opinion, he said, "The death sentence and the life sentence are equally immoral. But if I had to choose between the death penalty and imprisonment for life, I would certainly choose the second. To live anyhow is better than not at all." A lively discussion arose. The banker, who was younger and more nervous in those days, was suddenly carried away by excitement. He struck the table with his fist and shouted at the young man, "It's not true. I'll bet you 2 million you wouldn't stay in solitary confinement for 5 years." "If you mean that in earnest," said the young man, "I'll take the bet, but I would stay not 5, but 15 years. 15? Done," cried the banker. "Gentlemen, I stake 2 million. "Agreed. You stake your millions, and I stake my freedom," said the young man. And this wild, senseless bet was carried out. The banker, spoiled and frivolous, with millions beyond his reckoning, was delighted at the bet. At supper, he made fun of the young man and said, "Think better of it, young man, while there is still time. To me, 2 million is a trifle, but you are losing 3 or 4 of the best years of your life." Now, I say 3 or 4 because you won't stay longer. Don't forget either, you unhappy man, that voluntary confinement is a great deal harder to bear than compulsory. The thought that you have the right to step out in liberty at any moment will poison your whole existence in prison. I am sorry for you. And now the banker, walking to and fro, remembered all this and asked himself, what was the object of that bet? What is the good of that man's losing 15 years of his life and my throwing away 2 million? Can it prove that the death penalty is better or worse than imprisonment for life? No, no. It was all nonsensical and meaningless. On my part, it was the caprice of a pampered man, and on his part, simple greed for money. Then he remembered what followed that evening. It was decided that the young man should spend the years of his captivity under the strictest supervision in one of the lodges in the banker's garden. It was agreed that for 15 years he should not be free to cross the threshold of the lodge, to see human beings, to hear the human voice, or to receive letters and newspapers. He was allowed to have a musical instrument and books, and was allowed to write letters, to drink wine, and to smoke. By the terms of the agreement, the only relations he could have with the outer world were by a little window made purposely for that object. He might have anything he wanted, books, music, wine, and so on, in any quantity he desired by writing an order, but could only receive them through the window. The agreement provided for every detail and every trifle that would make his imprisonment strictly solitary, and bound the young man to stay there exactly 15 years, beginning from 12 o'clock of November 14th, 1870, and ending at 12 o'clock of November 14th, 1885. The slightest attempt on his part to break the conditions, if only 2 minutes before the end, released the banker from the obligation to pay him the 2 million. For the first year of his confinement, as far as one could judge from his brief notes, the prisoner suffered severely from loneliness and depression. The sounds of the piano could be heard continually, day and night, from his lodge. He refused wine and tobacco. Wine, he wrote, excites the desires, and desires are the worst foe of the prisoner. And besides, nothing could be more dreary than drinking good wine and seeing no one. And tobacco spoilt the air of his room. Well, in the first year, the books he sent for were principally of a light character. Novels with a complicated love plot, sensational and fantastical stories, and so on. And in the second year, the piano was silent in the lodge, and the prisoner asked only for the classics. In the fifth year, music was audible again, and the prisoner asked for wine. Those who watched him through the window said that all that year he spent doing nothing but eating and drinking and lying on his bed, well, frequently yawning and angrily talking to himself. He did not read books. Sometimes at night he would sit down to write. He would spend hours writing, and in the morning tear up all that he had written. More than once, he could be heard crying. In the second half of the sixth year, the prisoner began zealously studying languages, philosophy, and history. He threw himself eagerly into these studies, so much so that the banker had enough to do to get him the books he ordered. In the course of 4 years, some 600 volumes were procured at his request. It was during this period that the banker received the following letter from his prisoner. My dear jailer, I write you these lines in 6 languages. Show them to people who know the languages. Let them read them. If they find not one mistake, I implore you to fire a shot in the garden. That shot will show me that my efforts have not been thrown away. The geniuses of all ages and of all lands speak different languages, but the same flame burns in them all. Oh, if you only knew what unearthly happiness my soul feels now from being able to understand them. The prisoner's desire was fulfilled. The banker ordered 2 shots to be fired in the garden. Then, after the 10th year, the prisoner sat immovably at the table and read nothing but the gospel. It seemed strange to the banker that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 learned volumes should waste nearly a year over one thin book, easy of comprehension. Theology and histories of religion followed the Gospels. In the last 2 years of his confinement, the prisoner read an immense quantity of books, quite indiscriminately. Well, at one time he was busy with the natural sciences. Then he would ask for Byron or Shakespeare. There were notes in which he demanded at the same time books on chemistry and a manual on medicine and a novel and some treatise on philosophy or theology. His reading suggested a man swimming in the sea among the wreckage of his ship and trying to save his life by greedily clutching first at one spar and then at another. The old banker remembered all of this and thought, well, tomorrow at 12 o'clock, he will regain his freedom. By our agreement, I ought to pay him 2 million. If I do pay him, it is all over with me. I shall be utterly ruined. 15 years before, his millions had been beyond his reckoning. Now he was afraid to ask himself which were greater, his debts or his assets. Desperate gambling on the stock exchange, wild speculation in the excitability which he could not get over even in advancing years, had by degrees led to the decline of his fortune, and the proud, fearless, self-confident millionaire had become a banker of middling rank, trembling at every rise and fall in his investments. Cursed bet, muttered the old man, clutching his head in despair. Why didn't the man die? But he's only 40 now. He will take my last penny from me. He will marry and will enjoy life, will gamble on the exchange, while I look at him with envy like a beggar, then hear from him every day the same sentence. I am indebted to you for the happiness of my life. Let me help you. No, it's too much. The one means of being saved from bankruptcy and disgrace is the death of that man. It struck 3 o'clock. The banker listened. Everyone was asleep in the house, and nothing could be heard outside but the rustling of the chilled trees. Trying to make no noise, he took from a fireproof safe the key of the door, which had not been opened for 15 years, put on his overcoat, and went out of the house. And it was cold and dark in the garden. Rain was falling. A damp, cutting wind was racing about the garden, howling and giving the trees no rest. The banker strained his eyes, but could see neither the earth, nor the white statues, nor the lodge, nor the trees. Going to the spot where the lodge stood, he twice called the watchman. No answer followed. Evidently, the watchman had sought shelter from the weather and was now asleep somewhere, either in the kitchen or in the greenhouse. Well, if I had the pluck to carry out my intention, thought the old man, suspicion would fall first upon the watchman. He felt in the darkness for the steps and the door and went into the entry of the lodge. There he groped his way into a little passage and lighted a match. There was not a soul there. There was a bedstead with no bedding on it, and in the corner there was a dark cast iron stove. The seals on the door leading to the prisoner's room were intact. When the match went out, the old man, trembling with emotion, peeped through the little window. A candle was burning dimly in the prisoner's room. He was sitting at the table. Nothing could be seen but his back, the hair on his head and his hands. Open books were lying on the table, on the 2 easy chairs, and on the carpet near the table. 5 minutes passed, and the prisoner did not once stir. 15 years' imprisonment had taught him to sit still. The banker tapped at the window with his finger, and the prisoner made no movement whatever in response. Then the banker cautiously broke the seals off the door and put the key in the keyhole. The rusty lock gave a grating sound and the door creaked. The banker expected to hear at once footsteps and a cry of astonishment, but 3 minutes passed, and it was quiet as ever in the room. He made up his mind to go in. At the table, a man unlike ordinary people was sitting motionless. He was a skeleton with the skin drawn tight over his bones, with the long curls like a woman's and a shaggy beard. His face was yellow with an earthly tint in it. His cheeks were hollow, his back long and narrow, and the hand on which his shaggy head was propped was so thin and delicate that it was dreadful to look at it. His hair was already streaked with silver, and seeing his emaciated, aged-looking face, no one would have believed that he was only 40. He was asleep. In front of his bowed head, there lay on the table a sheet of paper on which there was something written in fine handwriting. Poor creature, thought the banker. He's asleep and most likely dreaming of the millions. And I only have to take this half-dead man, throw him on the bed, stifle him a little with the pillow, and the most conscientious expert would find no sign of a violent death. But let us first read what he has written here. The banker took the page from the table and read as follows. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, I regain my freedom and the right to associate with other men. But before I leave this room and see the sunshine, I think it necessary to say a few words to you. With a clear conscience, I tell you, as before God, who beholds me, that I despise freedom and life and health and all that in your books is called the good things of the world. For 15 years, I have been intently studying earthly life. It is true, I have not seen the earth nor men, but in your books I have drunk fragrant wine. I have sung songs. I have hunted stags and wild boars in the forests. I have loved women, beauties as ethereal as clouds, created by the magic of your poets and geniuses, have visited me at night and have whispered in my ears wonderful tales that have set my brain in a whirl. In your books, I have climbed to the peaks of Elbrus and Mont Blanc, and from there I have seen the sunrise and have watched it at evening flood the sky, the ocean, and the mountaintops with gold and crimson. I have watched from there the lightning flashing over my head and cleaving the storm clouds. I have seen green forests, fields, rivers, lakes, towns. I have heard the singing of the sirens and the strains of the shepherds. I have touched the wings of comely devils who flew down to converse with me of God. In your books, I have flung myself into the bottomless pit, performed miracles, slain, burned towns, preached new religions, conquered whole kingdoms. Your books have given me wisdom. All that the unresting thought of man has created in the ages is compressed into a small compass in my brain. I know that I am wiser than all of you, and I despise your books. I despise wisdom and the blessings of this world. It is all worthless, fleeting, illusory, and deceptive. It's like a mirage. You may be proud, wise, and fine, but death will wipe you off the face of the earth as though you were no more than mice burrowing under the floor. And your posterity, your history, your immortal geniuses will burn or freeze together with the earthly globe. You have lost your reason and taken the wrong path. You have taken lies for truth and hideousness for beauty. You would marvel if, owing to strange events of some sorts, frogs and lizards suddenly grew on apple and orange trees instead of fruit, or if roses began to smell like a sweating horse. So I marvel at you who exchange heaven for earth. I don't want to understand you. To prove to you in action how I despise all that you live by, I renounce the 2 million of which I once dreamed as of paradise, in which I now despise. To deprive myself of the right to the money, I shall go out from here 5 hours before the time fixed, and so break the compact. Well, when the banker had read this, he laid the page on the table, kissed the strange man on the head, and went out of the lodge weeping. At no other time, even when he had lost heavily on the stock exchange, had he felt so great a contempt for himself. When he got home, he lay on his bed, but his tears and emotion kept him for hours from sleeping. Next morning, the watchman ran in with pale faces and told him they had seen the man who lived in the lodge climb out of the window into the garden, go to the gate, and disappear. The banker went at once with the servants to the lodge and made sure of the flight of his prisoner. To avoid arousing unnecessary talk, he took from the table the writing in which the millions were renounced, and when he got home, locked it up in the fireproof safe.
Thank you, Cleo. Wonderful, and I'm glad we got through that story. Our next tale is by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is an English author of short fiction, novels, graphic novels, nonfiction, audio theater, and films. His works include the comic book series The Sandman and the novels Stardust, American Gods, and Coraline. He's won numerous awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Bram Stoker Awards, as well as the Newbery and Carnegie Medals. He's also the author of Good Omens, which was adapted by Amazon as a short miniseries in 2020. The next story, We Can Get It For You Wholesale, imagines a rather nondescript man who has a passion for bargains, and it gets way out of hand. This is We Can Get Them For You Wholesale by Neil Gaiman. Peter Pinter had never heard of Aristippus of the Cyrenaics, a lesser known follower of Socrates, who maintained that the avoidance of trouble was the highest attainable good. However, he had lived his uneventful life according to this precept. In all respects except one, an inability to pass up a bargain, and which of us is entirely free from that, he was a very moderate man. He did not go to extremes. His speech was proper and reserved. He rarely overate. He drank enough to be sociable and no more. He was far from rich and in no wise poor. He liked people and people liked him. Bearing all that in mind, would you expect to find him in a low-life pub on the senior side of London's East End, taking out what is colloquially known as a contract on someone he hardly knew? You would not. You would not even expect to find him in a pub. And until a certain Friday afternoon, you would have been right. But the love of a woman can do strange things to a man, even one so colorless as Peter Pinter. And the discovery that Miss Gwendolen Thorpe, 23 years of age, of 9 Oak Tree Terrace, Purley, was messing about, as the vulgar would put it, with a smooth young gentleman from the accounting department, after, mark you, she had consented to wear an engagement ring composed of real ruby chips, 9-carat gold, and something that might well have been a diamond, 37 pounds 50, that it had taken Peter almost an entire lunch hour to choose. This can do very strange things to a man indeed. After he made this shocking discovery, Peter spent a sleepless Friday night tossing and turning with visions of Gwendolen and Archie Gibbons, the Don Juan of Clamage's accounting department, dancing and swimming before his eyes, performing acts that even Peter, if he were pressed, would have to admit were most improbable. But the bile of jealousy had risen up within him, and by the morning Peter had resolved that his rival should be done away with. Saturday morning was spent wondering how one contacted an assassin, for, to the best of Peter's knowledge, none were employed by Clamage's, the department store that employed all three of the members of our eternal triangle, and incidentally furnished the ring. And he was wary of asking anyone outright for fear of attracting attention to himself. Thus, it was that Saturday afternoon that found him hunting through the yellow pages. Assassins, he found, was not between asphalt contractors and assessors quantity. Killers were not between kennels and kindergartens. Murderers were not between mowers and museums. Pest control looked promising. However, close investigation of the pest control advertisements showed them to be almost solely concerned with rats, mice, fleas, cockroaches, rabbits, moles, and rats, to quote from one that Peter felt was rather hard on rats, and not really what he had in mind. Even so, being of a careful nature, he dutifully inspected the entries in that category, and at the bottom of the second page, in small print, he found a firm that looked promising. Complete, discreet disposal of irksome and unwanted mammals, etc., went the entry. Ketch, Hare, Burke, and Ketch, the old firm. It went on to give no address, but only a telephone number. Peter dialed the number, surprising himself by doing so. His heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to look nonchalant. The telephone rang once, twice, 3 times. Peter was just starting to hope that it would not be answered, and he could forget the whole thing, when there was a click, and a brisk young female voice said, "Ketch, Hare, Burke, and Ketch. Can I help you?" Carefully, not giving his name, Peter said, how big? I mean, What size mammals do you go up to dispose of? Well, that would all depend on what size Sir requires. He plucked up his courage. A person? Her voice remained brisk and unruffled. Of course, sir. Do you have a pen and paper handy? Good. Be at the Dirty Donkey Pub off Little Courtney Street, E3, tonight at 8 o'clock. Carry a rolled up copy of the Financial Times. That's the pink one, sir. And our operative will approach you there. Then she put down the phone. Peter was elated. It had been far easier than he imagined. He went down to the newsagents and bought a copy of the Financial Times, found Little Courtney Street in his A to Z of London, and spent the rest of the afternoon watching football on the television and imagining the smooth young gentleman from accounting's funeral. It took Peter a while to find the pub. Eventually, he spotted the pub sign, which showed a donkey and was indeed remarkably dirty. The Dirty Donkey was a small and more or less filthy pub, poorly lit, in which knots of unshaven people wearing dusty donkey jackets stood around eyeing each other suspiciously, eating crisps and drinking pints of Guinness, a drink that Peter never cared for. Peter held his Financial Times under one arm as conspicuously as he could, but no one approached him. So he bought half a shandy and retreated to a corner table. Unable to think of anything else to do while waiting, he tried to read the paper, but lost and confused by a maze of grain futures and a rubber company that was selling something or other short, quite what the short somethings were, he could not tell. He gave it up and stared at the door. He waited almost 10 minutes when a small busy man hustled in, looked quickly around him, and then came straight over to Peter's table and sat down. He stuck out his hand. Kemble, Burton Kemble of Ketch, Hare, Burke, and Ketch. I hear you have a job for us. He didn't look like a killer. Peter said so. Oh, Lord bless us, no. I'm not actually a part of our workforce, sir. I'm in sales. Peter nodded. That made a certain sense. Uh, can we talk freely here? Oh, sure. Nobody's interested. Now then, how many people would you like to dispose of? Only one. His name is Archibald Gibbons, and he works in Clamage's accounting department. His address is, Kemble interrupted. We can go into all of that later, sir, if you don't mind. Let's just go over the financial side. First of all, the contract will cost you £500. Peter nodded. He could afford that, and in fact expected to pay a little more. Although there's always the special offer, Kemble concluded smoothly. Peter's eyes shone. As I mentioned earlier, he loved a bargain and often bought things he had no imaginable use for in sales or on special offers. Apart from this one failing, one that so many of us share, he was the most moderate young man. Special offer? Two for the price of one, sir. Peter thought about it. That worked out to only 250 quid each, which couldn't be bad no matter how you looked at it. There was only one snag. I'm afraid I don't have anybody else I want killed. Campbell looked disappointed. Oh, that's a pity, sir. For two, we could probably have knocked down the price to, well, £450 for both of them. Really? Well, it gives our operatives something to do, sir, if you must know. And here he dropped his voice. There really isn't enough work in this particular line to keep them occupied. Not like in the old days. Isn't there just one other person you'd like to see dead? Peter pondered. He hated to pass up a bargain, but couldn't for the life of him think of anyone else. He liked people. Still, a bargain was a bargain. Look, said Peter, could I think about it and see you here tomorrow night? The salesman looked pleased. Of course, sir, he said. I'm sure you'll be able to think of someone. The answer, the obvious answer, came to Peter as he was drifting off to sleep that night. He sat up in bed, fumbled the bedside light on, and wrote a name down on the back of an envelope in case he forgot it. To tell the truth, he didn't think he could forget it, for it was painfully obvious, but you could never tell with these late night thoughts. The name that he had written down on the back of the envelope was Gwendolyn Thorpe. He turned the light off, rolled over, and was soon asleep, dreaming peacefully and remarkably unmurderous dreams. Campbell was waiting for him when he arrived in the Dirty Donkey on Sunday night. Peter bought a drink and sat down beside him. I'm taking you up on the special offer, he said by way of greeting. Campbell nodded vigorously. A very wise decision, if you don't mind me saying so, sir. Peter smiled modestly, in the manner of one who read the Financial Times and made wise business decisions. That will be £450, I believe. Did I say £450, sir? Oh, good gracious me. I do apologize. I beg your pardon. I was thinking of our bulk rate. It would be 475 for two people. Disappointment mingled with cupidity on Peter's bland and youthful face. That was an extra 25 quid. However, something that Campbell said had caught his attention. Bulk rate? Well, of course, but I doubt that Sir would be interested in that. No, I am. Tell me about it. Well, very well, sir. Bulk rate, £450 would be a large job, 10 people. Peter wondered if he had heard it correctly. 10 people? But that's only £45 each. Well, yes, sir. It's the large order that makes it profitable. I see, said Peter. And, said Peter. And could you be here at the same time tomorrow night? Of course, sir. Upon arriving home, Peter got out a scrap of paper and a pen. He wrote the numbers 1 to 10 on one side and then filled it in as follows. 1, Archie. 2, Gwenny. 3, and so forth. Having filled in the first two, he sat sucking his pen, hunting for wrongs done to him and people the world would be better off without. He smoked a cigarette. He strolled around the room. Aha! There was a physics teacher at school that he had attended who had delighted in making his life a misery. What was the man's name again? And for that matter, was he still alive? Peter wasn't sure, but he wrote the physics teacher, Abbott Street Secondary School, next to the number 3. The next came more easily. His department head had refused to raise his salary a couple of months back. That the raise had eventually come was immaterial. Mr. Hunterson was number 4. When he was 5, a boy named Simon Ellis had poured paint on his head, while another boy named James somebody or other had held him down, and a girl named Sharon Harsharp had laughed. They were numbers 5 through 7, respectively. Who else? There was the man on television with the annoying snicker who read the news. He went on the list. And what about the woman in the flat next door with the little yappy dog that shat in the hall? He put her and the dog down on 9. 10 was the hardest. He scratched his head and went into the kitchen for a cup of coffee and then dashed back and wrote, my great Uncle Mervyn down in the 10th place. The old man was rumored to be quite affluent, and there was a possibility, albeit rather slim, that he could leave Peter some money. With satisfaction of an evening's work done, he went off to bed. Monday at Clemons was routine. Peter was senior sales assistant in the books department, a job that actually entailed very little. He clutched his list tightly in his hand, deep in his pocket, rejoicing in the feeling of power that it gave him. He spent a most enjoyable lunch hour in the canteen with young Gwendolyn, who did not know that he had seen her and Archie in the stockroom together, and even smiled at the smooth young man from the accounting department when he passed him in the corridor. He proudly displayed his list to Kemble that evening. The little salesman's face fell. I'm afraid this isn't 10 people, Mr. Pinter, he explained. You counted the woman in the next door flat and her dog as one person. Well, that brings it to 11, which would be extra. His pocket calculator was rapidly deployed. An extra 70 pounds. How about if we forget the dog? Peter shook his head. Oh, the dog is as bad as the woman, or worse. Excuse me. Then I'm afraid we have a slight problem, unless. What? Unless you'd like to take advantage of a wholesale rate. But of course, so wouldn't be. There are words that do things to people, words that make people's faces flush with joy, excitement, or passion. Environmental can be one, occult is another. Wholesale was Peter's. He leaned back in his chair. Tell me about it, he said, with the practiced assurance of an experienced shopper. Well, sir, said Kemble, allowing himself a little chuckle, we can get them for you wholesale, £17.50 each for every quarry after the first 50, or a tenner for everyone over 200. I suppose you'd go down to a fiver if I wanted 1,000 people knocked off. Oh, no, sir, Kemble looked quite shocked. Yeah, if you're talking about those figures, we can do them for a quid each. £1? No, that's right, sir. There's not a big profit in it, but the high turnover and productivity more than justifies it. Kemble got up. Same time tomorrow, sir? Peter nodded. £1,000, 1,000 people. People, Peter Pinter didn't even know 1,000 people. Even so, there were the Houses of Parliament. He didn't like politicians. They squabbled and argued and carried on so. And for that matter, an idea shocking in its audacity, bold, daring. Still, the idea was there and it wouldn't go away. A distant cousin of his had married the younger brother of an earl or a baron or something. On his way home from work that afternoon, he stopped off at a little shop that he had passed 1,000 times without entering. It had a large sign in the window guaranteeing to trace your lineage for you and even draw up a coat of arms if you'd happen to have mislaid your own, and an impressive heraldic map. Maybe now that the darkness had lifted from her mind, all she wanted to be was with her family again. And they were very helpful and phoned him up just after 7 to give him their news. If approximately 14,072,811 people died, he, Peter Pinter, would be King of England. He didn't have 14,072,811 pounds, but he suspected that when you were talking in those figures, Mr. Kemble would have one of his special discounts. Mr. Kemble did. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. Actually, he explained, it works out quite cheaply. You see, we wouldn't have to do them all individually. Small-scale nuclear weapons, some judicious bombing, gassing, plague, dropping radios into swimming pools, and then mopping up the stragglers, say £4,000. 4,000? That's incredible. The salesman looked pleased with himself. Our operatives will be glad of the work, sir, he grinned. We pride ourselves on servicing our wholesale customers. The wind blew cold as Peter left the pub, setting the old sign swinging. It didn't look much like a dirty donkey, thought Peter, more like a pale horse. Peter was drifting off to sleep that night, mentally rehearsing his coronation speech, when a thought drifted into his head and hung around. It would not go away. Could he, could he possibly be passing up an even larger savings than he already had? Could he be missing out on a bargain? Peter climbed out of bed and walked over to the phone. It was 3 a.m., but even so, his yellow pages lay open where he had left it the previous Sunday, and he dialed the number. The phone seemed to ring forever. There was a click, and a bored voice said, "Burke, Hare and Ketch, can I help you?" I hope I'm not phoning too late," he began. "Oh, of course not, sir. I was wondering if I could speak to Mr. Kemble. Can you hold? I'll see if he's available." Peter waited for a couple of minutes, listening to the ghostly crackles and whispers that always echoed down empty phone lines. "Are you there, caller?" "Yes, I'm here." "Putting you through." There was a buzz, and then, "Kemble speaking." "Ah, Mr. Kemble, hello. Sorry if I got you out of bed or anything. This is Peter Pinter." "Yes, Mr. Pinter." "Well, I'm sorry it's so late, but I was only wondering, how much would it cost to kill everybody? Everybody in the whole world. Everybody? All the people?" Yes. How much? I mean, for an order like that, you'd have to have some kind of big discount. How much would it be for everyone?" "Nothing at all, Mr. Pinter." "You mean you wouldn't do it?" "Oh, I mean we'd do it for nothing, Mr. Pinter. You only have to be asked, you see. We always have to be asked." Peter was puzzled. "But when would you start?" "Start? Right away, now. Well, we've been ready for a long time, but we had to be asked, Mr. Pinter. Good night. It's been a pleasure doing business with you." The line went dead. Peter felt strange. Everything seemed very distant. He wanted to sit down. What on earth had the man meant? We always have to be asked. It was definitely strange, and nobody does anything for nothing in this world. He had a good mind to phone Kemble back and call the whole thing off. Perhaps he had overreached. There was a perfectly innocent reason why Archie and Gwendolyn had entered the stockroom together. He would talk to her. That's what he would do. He'd talk to Gwenny first thing in the morning. That's when the noises started. Odd cries across the street. A cat fight? Foxes, probably. He'd hoped someone would throw a shoe at them. Then from the corridor outside his flat, he heard a muffled clumping, as if somebody were dragging something very heavily along the floor. It stopped. Somebody knocked on his door twice, very softly. Outside his windows, the cries were getting louder. Peter sat in his chair, knowing that somehow, somewhere, he was missing something important. The knocking redoubled. He was thankful that he had always locked and chained his door at night. They'd been ready for a long time, but they had to be asked. When the thing came through the door, Peter started screaming, but he really didn't scream very long. Thank you. We've got one last story for you. This is a story by Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin was an American author of short stories and novels based in Louisiana. She is considered by scholars to be a forerunner of the early 20th century feminist authors of Southern or Catholic background. Based in New Orleans, she specialized in expressing the inner life of women who feel they have no voice. In the next story, A Pair of Silk Stockings, a woman of humble means, has an afternoon she will not forget. The story will be read by Pamela Lambert.
A Pair of Silk Stockings by Kate Chopin. Little Mrs. Summers one day found herself the unexpected possessor of $15. It seemed to her a very large amount of money, and the way in which it stuffed and bulged her worn-out old portemonnaie gave her a feeling of importance such as she had not enjoyed for years. The question of investment was one that occupied her greatly. For a day or two, she walked about, apparently in a dreamy state, but really absorbed in speculation and calculation. She did not wish to act hastily, to do anything she might afterward regret, but it was during the still hours of the night, when she lay awake revolving plans in her mind, that she seemed to see her way clearly toward a proper and judicious use of the money. $1 or two should be added to the price usually paid for Janie's shoes, which would ensure their lasting an appreciable time longer than they usually did. She would buy so and so many yards of percale for new shirtwaists for the boys and for Janie and Mag. She had intended to make the old ones do by skillful patching. Mag should have another gown. She had seen some beautiful patterns, veritable bargains in the shop windows. And still, there would be left enough for new stockings, 2 pairs apiece, and what darning that would save her for a while. She would get caps for the boys and sailor hats for the girls. The vision of her little brood looking fresh and dainty and new for once in their lives excited her and made her restless and wakeful with anticipation. The neighbors sometimes talked of certain better days that little Mrs. Summers had known before she had ever thought of being Mrs. Summers. She herself indulged in no such morbid retrospection. She had no time, no second of time to devote to the past. The needs of the present absorbed her every faculty. A vision of the future, like some dim, gaunt monster, sometimes appalled her, but luckily, tomorrow never comes. Mrs. Summers was one who knew the value of bargains, who could stand for hours making her way, inch by inch, toward the desired object that was selling below cost. She could elbow her way if need be. She had learned to clutch a piece of goods and hold it and stick to it with persistence and determination till her turn came to be served, no matter when it came. But that day, she was a little faint and tired. She had swallowed a light luncheon. No, when she came to think of it, between getting the children fed and the place righted and preparing herself for the shopping bout, she had actually forgotten to eat any luncheon at all. She sat herself upon a revolving stool before a counter that was comparatively deserted, trying to gather strength and courage to charge through an eager multitude that was besieging breastworks of shirting and figured lawn. An all-gone limp feeling had come over her, and she rested her hand aimlessly on the counter. She wore no gloves. By degrees, she grew aware that her hand had encountered something very soothing, very pleasant to the touch. She looked down to see that her hand lay upon a pile of silk stockings. A placard nearby announced that they had been reduced in price from $2.50 to $1.98. And a young girl who stood behind the counter asked her if she wished to examine their line of silk hosiery. She smiled, just as if she had been asked to inspect a tiara of diamonds with the ultimate view of purchasing it. But she went on feeling the soft, sheeny, luxurious things, with both hands now, holding them up to see them glisten and to feel them glide, serpent-like, through her fingers. 2 hectic blotches came suddenly into her pale cheeks. She looked up at the girl. "Do you think there are any 8s½ among these?" There were any number of 8s½. In fact, there were more of that size than any other. Here was a light blue pair. There was some lavender, some all black and various shades of tan and gray. Mrs. Summers selected a black pair and looked at them very long and closely. She pretended to be examining their texture, which the clerk assured her was excellent. $1.98, she mused aloud. Well, I'll take this pair. She handed the girl a $5 bill and waited for her change and for her parcel. Oh, what a very small parcel it was. It seemed lost in the depths of her shabby old shopping bag. Mrs. Summers, after that, did not move in the direction of the bargain counter. She took the elevator, which carried her to an upper floor into the region of the ladies' waiting rooms. Here, in a retired corner, she exchanged her cotton stockings for the new silk ones which she had just bought. She was not going through any acute mental process or reasoning with herself, nor was she striving to explain to her satisfaction the motive of her action. She was not thinking at all. She seemed for the time to be taking a rest from that laborious and fatiguing function, and to have abandoned herself to some mechanical impulse that directed her actions and freed her of responsibility. How good was the touch of the raw silk to her flesh. She felt like lying back in the cushioned chair and reveling for a while in the luxury of it. She did that for a little while. Then she replaced her shoes, rolled the cotton stockings together, and thrust them into her bag. After doing this, she crossed straight over to the shoe department and took her seat to be fitted. She was fastidious. The clerk could not make her out. He could not reconcile her shoes with her stockings, and she was not too easily pleased. She held back her skirts and turned her feet one way and her head another way, and her head, and she glanced down at the polished, pointed-tipped boots. Her foot and ankle looked very pretty. She could not realize that they belonged to her and were a part of herself. She wanted an excellent and stylish fit, she told the young fellow who served her, and she did not mind the difference of $1 or $2 more in the price, so long as she got what she desired. It was a long time since Mrs. Summers had been fitted with gloves. On rare occasions, when she had bought a pair, they were always bargains, so cheap that it would have been preposterous and unreasonable to have expected them to be fitted to the hand. Now, she rested her elbow on the cushion of the glove counter, and a pretty, pleasant young creature, delicate and deft of touch, drew a long-wristed kid over Mrs. Summers' hand. She smoothed it down over the wrist and buttoned it neatly, and both lost themselves for a second or two in admiring contemplation of the little symmetrical gloved hand. But there were other places where money might be spent. There were books and magazines piled up in the window of a stall a few paces down the street. Mrs. Summers bought 2 high-priced magazines, such as she had been accustomed to read in the days when she had been accustomed to other pleasant things. She carried them without wrapping. As well as she could, she lifted her skirts at the crossings. Her stockings and boots and well-fitting gloves had worked marvels in her bearing, had given her a feeling of assurance, a sense of belonging to the well-dressed multitude. She was very hungry. Another time, she would have stilled the craving for food until reaching her own home, where she would have brewed herself a cup of tea and then taken a snack of anything that was available. But the impulse that was guiding her would not suffer her to entertain any such thought. There was a restaurant at the corner. She had never entered its doors. From the outside, she had sometimes caught glimpses of spotless damask and shining crystal and soft-stepping waiters serving people of fashion. When she entered, her appearance created no surprise, no consternation, as she had half feared it might. She seated herself at a small table alone, and an attentive waiter at once approached to take her order. She did not want a profusion. She craved a nice and tasty bite. A half-dozen blue points, a plump chop with cress, a something sweet, a creme frappé, for instance, a glass of Rhine wine, and after all, a small cup of black coffee. While waiting to be served, she removed her gloves very leisurely and laid them beside her. Then she picked up a magazine and glanced through it, cutting the pages with the blunt edge of her knife. It was all very agreeable. The damask was even more spotless than it had seemed through the window, and the crystal more sparkling. There were quiet ladies and gentlemen who did not notice her, lunching at the small tables like her own. A soft, pleasing strain of music could be heard, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the window. She tasted a bite, and she read a word or two, and she sipped the amber wine and wiggled her toes in the silk stockings. The price of it made no difference. She counted the money out to the waiter and left an extra coin on his tray, whereupon he bowed before her as a princess of royal blood. There was still money in her purse, and her next temptation presented itself in the shape of a matinee poster. It was a little later when she had entered the theater. The play had begun, and the house seemed to her to be packed, but there were vacant seats here and there, and into one of them she was ushered, between brilliantly dressed women who had gone there to kill time and eat candy and display their gaudy attire. There were many others who were there solely for the play and the acting. It's safe to say there was no one present who bore quite the attitude which Mrs. Summers did to her surroundings. She gathered in the whole, stage and players and people, in one wide impression, and absorbed it and enjoyed it. She laughed at the comedy and wept. Oh, she and the gaudy woman next to her wept over the tragedy, and they talked a little together over it, and the gaudy woman wiped her eyes and sniffled on a tiny square of filmy perfumed lace and passed little Mrs. Summers her box of candy. The play was over. The music ceased. The crowd filed out. It was like a dream ended. People scattered in all directions. Mrs. Summers went to the corner and waited for the cable car. A man with keen eyes who sat opposite to her seemed to like the study of her small, pale face. It puzzled him to decipher what he saw there. In truth, he saw nothing, unless he were wizard enough to detect a poignant wish, a powerful longing that the cable car would never stop anywhere, but go on and on with her forever.
Thank you, Pam. I want to thank all of our readers today, Pamela Lambert, Cleo Zanni, and Stephen Rourke. We really appreciate you coming to see us today. We have a wonderful time when we do this, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on April 10th. We'll have information out about that sometime soon. But thank you again, and love having you here. Well done, everyone. Well done. So it really can't go wrong with a lineup like this, and just enjoy having it.
Technically.
Well, you can't go wrong if you don't have a